The night after I told my parents about my experience in the upstairs hallway, I was awoken at about 2:30 AM in the morning by the sound of the bell ringing in the kitchen. It was loud and it was constant, as if it was being pulled firmly and with intent. I ran out into the hallway and my parents were there too, equally as concerned and confused as I was. We all looked at each other with an expression of intense fear on our faces. We all ran downstairs into the kitchen to see what was going on, but as soon as we entered the kitchen, the ringing stopped. Watch this video until the end to find out why this girl and her family were so terrified they were forced to flee their home. I'm your host, Severed Soul. This story follows a young girl who moves to Montana following the divorce of her parents. Alone, on the first night in her new home, with only her cat for company, she starts to realise that there might be something sinister lurking within those walls. First, she notices that her cat keeps hissing at something in the kitchen. Second, the faucet in the kitchen keeps turning on by itself. But soon, things get much worse, and the girl becomes very creeped out by what she sees in the kitchen. This is her story. The following is a non-fictional story covering a few incidents I experienced when I moved into my new home as a high school student in Montana. I had been excited at the chance to make a fresh start after living in Texas my whole life and enduring the somewhat turbulent divorce of my parents. We moved to Montana as this was my mother's home state, and it was also where many of her close relatives still resided. After living in a caravan over the course of a few days and nights, we finally arrived at the new homestead. Too tired to unpack, we decided to grab some pizza. My mum left soon after to go and stay with her new husband at his company apartment nearby. On my first night in the new house, Pudding, my cat, and I stayed by ourselves, and I was really excited to explore and get to know the new home. I set up a cot in the living room and scored big when I plugged the TV into the aerial and got all the available channels. There's nothing more frustrating than turning the TV on and not having any decent channels. Whilst making myself comfy on the cot, I couldn't help but notice that my cat would randomly hiss at certain areas within the house. At the time, I'd had Pudding for less than a year, and just thought that she was being skittish as she became accustomed to her new environment. However, while I was watching TV in the living room, I was alarmed when I heard the sound of water spraying from the faucet in the kitchen. I got up and walked into the kitchen and saw the water running from the tap into the sink. I turned it off, thinking clearly I need to put plumbing on the list of things to do. But as I turned around to leave the kitchen, I heard the sound of the faucet turn on again behind me. This time, I was creeped out. It was way too much of a coincidence for me to believe that this had only started happening that night. In the middle of the night, I was awoken mid-snore to my cat sitting on me rather than laying next to me. She was sitting upright, staring towards the kitchen and hissing loudly. It didn't take long for me to register that I could clearly hear the sound of the faucet in the kitchen running again. I sat up and placed Pudding next to me and proceeded to walk into the kitchen. What I saw as I entered the kitchen honestly made my blood run cold. The faucet was on, but the refrigerator door was slowly closing right in front of my eyes. There was absolutely nobody else in that kitchen. Trying my very best to remain logical, I turned the faucet off and placed a pot over it to weigh it down so it wouldn't turn on again. I grabbed the to-do list and jotted down the need to have a look at the seal on the refrigerator the very next morning. Returning to my cot in the middle of the living room, my cat was still sat there hissing intently, looking at the hallway with her hairs raised. I proceeded to pick her up off the ground and place her on my legs, falling asleep the way only teenagers can. The next morning I woke up and walked into the kitchen, expecting Pudding to follow closely behind. But she didn't. The pot that I had used to weigh down the faucet was now in the middle of the kitchen floor, only I hadn't been woken up by the sound of it falling in the night. I examined both the faucet and the refrigerator seal, but couldn't find anything that needed repair. I've never really been much of a believer in the paranormal, however, I'm really struggling to find another explanation for what I witnessed. I just hope this isn't a sign of things to come in our new home. A woman and her family have moved into rental accommodation, and the lease is up for renewal. The problem is, the woman has been experiencing possible paranormal phenomena in their home, and is hesitant to renew the lease. Her husband, however, is reluctant to believe her, and thinks that she is imagining things. After all, he hasn't witnessed anything even slightly paranormal. But that may all soon change. This is their terrifying story. My family and I have been renting our current home for almost a year, and we're due to sign a new lease next month. When we first moved in, we were completely unaware that the previous owner of the house had passed away under somewhat questionable circumstances. We were only informed about the history of the house during a casual conversation with the landlord a few months into the tenancy. There are 6 of us living in this house, and for about 4 months now, all 6 of us have experienced things that we just can't explain. Personally, I have seen black, shadowy type figures in my peripheral vision on frequent occasions, but when I turn to look towards where the movement's coming from, it disappears. I felt cold and hot spots at different locations throughout the house quite frequently. I've witnessed the curtains twitching slightly, and on one occasion, I could have sworn blind that I could see the impression of a human figure standing behind the curtains. When I inspected the curtain, the figure disappeared immediately. I would always relay my experiences to my husband, but he insisted that I was being overdramatic or imagining things. That was until something happened recently that chilled him to his core. He has now finally acknowledged that there is indeed something paranormal within our home. I was sitting at the breakfast nook, just in front of where our kitchen bar is. My husband was sitting on the couch directly in front of me, and my 19-year-old son was sitting in the dining room, which is situated just behind the kitchen. I must stress that at this moment only the 3 of us were in the house, and there was no open windows or drafts anywhere. I had a very clear view of my son's bedroom door. I was sitting, enjoying my coffee, just kind of staring into space, when I witnessed the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. The handle of my son's bedroom door started slowly moving up and down. I shouted for my husband's attention, and initially he seemed really put out to take his focus away from the TV. But when he finally looked over to where I was pointing, his jaw dropped. The door handle was now violently moving up and down, as if someone or something was trying to get out of that room. We both watched in a state of total disbelief as that bedroom door slowly opened on its own. My entire body was frozen stiff, and every inch of my skin was covered in goosebumps. After I regained my composure, I stood up and slowly walked behind my husband towards my son's bedroom. Just as we already knew, that room was completely empty. We are both entirely creeped out, and are seriously considering whether or not to renew our lease. What do you think we should do? "15-year-old girl experiences something quite creepy as she prepares to move out of her old home. It seems to be an isolated incident, so she thinks no more of it as she prepares to adapt to life in her new home. However, she is soon plagued by nightmares that seem all too real. Before long, the girl and her family move again to another new home, hoping to leave the nightmares behind. However, what she experiences in this new home gives her reason to believe that something more sinister than nightmares might be following her. This is her story. When I was 15 years old, my family decided to move to a new home. My parents were working long hours, and the place we were living in had no security, so they feared leaving me home alone. On moving day, we loaded our things into a truck and hired some workers to help move our stuff into our new home. We took everything we needed to our new home and left behind everything that we no longer wanted. We hired a team of cleaners to tidy up the place and clean up anything that was still remaining. We left everything in a pile in one room, so it was easy to clean and tidy. Me and my family were sitting in the car, and that's when my dad got a call from the security team to say that the security guard at the new apartment wasn't letting them in. He was saying that notice should have been given to the society before moving into the new home. My dad immediately got on the phone to speak to the man who was renting us this new apartment. This guy said that he had totally forgotten about us moving in and asked us if we could wait for another month. Obviously, my dad was incensed and boiling with rage, and straight up said no to the guy. There was no way we could wait for a month to move in. We were all shocked and worried, believing that now we had nowhere to live. That's when my dad called another man, who he knew was renting out his house. We had already discussed moving into this house, but it was really far away from my school, so in the end we decided not to. However, in that moment we were absolutely desperate, and luckily that house was available immediately, so we were able to move in the very same day. After all the toing and froing on the phone, my dad explained the situation to us and started the car. Just then, my mum realised that she might have left her mobile phone in the house and asked me to go back in to find it. He handed me the keys, and I walked up the driveway to the house. The door to this house was always jammed shut, and it required a lot of force to open it. Eventually, the door opened, but my momentum carried me through, and I fell to the floor, hitting the ground pretty hard. I groaned as I hit the floor pretty hard, and it took me a few seconds to regain my composure. When I looked up, I noticed my old doll sitting on the floor, propped up in the corner of the room facing me. It looked really creepy. For a few seconds, I didn't get up from the floor. I remained where I was, unable to take my eyes away from that creepy doll. The house was completely silent, apart from the sound of the wind blowing outside and the ticking of the clock that was still hanging on the wall. I'm not sure if it was because the rest of the house was so silent, but the sound of that ticking seemed way louder than usual. Eventually, I got up, and that's when I received a call from my mum to say that she'd found her phone inside the car. I was feeling pretty creeped out, so I climbed to my feet and made my way to the front door. I don't know why, but that moment felt like a scene from a horror movie. It felt like the doll was staring at me, and the clock was ticking way louder than it usually would. As I reached the door, two things happened. The first thing I noticed was that I could no longer hear the clock ticking, which was really strange as I'd literally just noticed how loud it was. The second thing was, as I reached for the handle of the door, I heard a really faint sound come from behind me. I turned around to see my old doll now face down flat on the floor, no longer propped up as it was just a few seconds before. I was now really rattled, so I promptly exited the house. Initially, everything seemed fine when we moved into our new home, but soon I started being plagued by dreams of our old home. In these dreams, I would see visions of my old creepy doll, but it always seemed to be in a different position to where I left it. Whenever I woke from these dreams, for a few seconds I'd hear the sound of that clock ticking before it faded away. Creepy thing was, we didn't have any clocks in the new home. Many spooky things happened to me in that home, things that I can't explain using simple logic, but we weren't there for very long. After 8 months, we moved away from that place because the public transport was miles away, which was a huge inconvenience. To be honest, I was really scared in that house, so I was relieved when it was time to move. I wasn't to know, at this point however, that things were about to get a lot creepier. We moved to a new set of apartments, and after a week or so of living there, one day I was in the elevator heading up to our apartment. On the way up, the elevator door opened, and an old woman walked in who instantly gave me the creeps. She was staring at me intensely, but I tried to act as though I didn't feel her gaze. Eventually, she asked me if I was new here, and I smiled awkwardly and said yes. Then, again, after a few seconds she spoke, asking me which floor I was living on. At this point, I wanted to get out of the elevator as soon as possible and take the stairs. But instead, I told her the truth, that I lived on the 6th floor. The next day, when I was heading towards the stairs to go to the building's terrace, I noticed a tatty-looking bag lying on the floor at the opposite end of the hallway to our apartment. I didn't know what it was, but there was just something not quite right about this bag. I couldn't put my finger on it. I left the bag alone and headed up to the terrace to read my book for a while. When I came back down from the terrace and entered our hallway, once again I noticed that creepy looking bag lying on the floor. Only this time, I'm sure it was closer to our apartment than it was before. As I walked down the hallway to our apartment, I noticed something that made my hairs stand on end. I could hear the sound of a clock ticking. It sounded exactly the same as it did in my dreams. I tried my best to ignore it and entered our apartment. The next day, upon exiting the apartment, I had my headphones on and casually locked the door behind me. As I turned around, I nearly had a heart attack when I noticed that scruffy bag lying on the floor right outside our apartment. I removed my headphones and straight away noticed the sound of that clock ticking again. I was really spooked out, and I don't know why I did it, but I picked the bag up and threw it down the garbage chute and carried on with my day. I returned home later that evening and entered our apartment. That week, my mum and dad were both out of town, so I was in the apartment alone. I had just gotten out of the shower when I heard a faint knocking on the front door. We had no peephole, so there was no way for me to see who was standing outside the door. Sheepishly, I asked who was there, to which a female voice responded, "When are you going to pick this up?" I'll admit it, at this point I was terrified, but I slowly opened the door, expecting to be greeted by somebody standing outside. To my shock, there was nobody standing outside the door, but when I looked down to the floor, there it was. That creepy, gruffy old bag. After taking a minute or two, deciding whether or not to throw the bag back down the garbage chute, curiosity took over, and I looked inside the bag. To my total dismay, inside the bag was my creepy old doll, and the clock from off the wall in our old home. When my parents arrived home, I explained the situation to them and revealed the contents of the tatty old bag. Needless to say, they were just as creeped out as I was. I ended up burning the bag along with my old doll and the clock, thinking that this would be the end of it. However, last night I had a nightmare about my old doll. It was sitting at the end of my bed staring at me. The scariest thing was, when I woke up from the nightmare, I could hear the sound of that clock ticking. What do you think I should do? The Haunting of Lylet Cottage by Reddit user HBiscuit26. Following the death of her father, a young girl moves to a new house with her mother and stepfather hoping for a fresh start. Their new home was a real bargain, and the family can't help but wonder why it was so cheap. The reason for the low purchase price becomes abundantly clear when the young girl starts seeing shadows moving around outside her bedroom door at night. But the paranormal activity doesn't end there, and soon the whole family decide to leave the house behind. This is the chilling story of Lylet Cottage. Before I start this story, I'd just like you to know that I'm predominantly a skeptic. Or, at least I was, until I moved into this house. I actually rarely talk about the events that happened there, because I don't have any rational explanation. But the chilling memories of that house have haunted me well into adulthood. Back in 2009, me, my mum, and my stepdad moved into a rustic old cottage in rural England. My biological father had passed away not long before, so this was a fresh start for us all. The house was an absolute bargain. It had 6 bedrooms, 2 very spacious living rooms, and a huge annex at the back of the house that was essentially a separate home. We couldn't work out why it was so cheap. We went for the viewing, and the family that lived there told us that their elderly mother had passed away peacefully in the annex. They said that they just needed to get away from the feeling of her in that cottage. This really should have been the first red flag. But we weren't put off, and we went ahead with the purchase of the house. As soon as we moved in, the atmosphere was incredibly unsettling. My parents didn't notice anything at first, but I was really uncomfortable in certain areas in the house. It was extremely unnerving, and it was freezing. Not to mention, it was isolated behind rows of trees down a long driveway, so it was really far from anyone else. It all started on the very first night. My room was at the end of a long corridor, and when you came out of my room, on the right was a bathroom and a locked door. This locked door headed towards the annex, the room where the old lady had died. My parents' bedroom was all the way down the other end of the corridor, so I felt further isolated. Directly opposite my bedroom door was the staircase. On the first night, the temperature in my bedroom was freakishly cold, so I pulled my blankets up over my head. After my dad passed away, I'd started suffering with insomnia, so I was struggling to get to sleep. The chill in the air, combined with my anxiety, meant that I was lying there awake for hours, just kind of staring around the room. My bedroom door was one of those old, mismatched, wooden country house doors, and it didn't quite reach the carpet. After a few hours, I could hear the creaking of the floorboards directly outside my bedroom door, and shadows that seemed to be even darker than the darkness of the hallway were creeping past my bedroom door. Initially, I presumed that one of my parents had gotten up to use the bathroom, but this went on for several minutes, back and forth, and it was fast, a very brisk walk. And not to mention, next to my door was the locked door to the annex. Anybody walking at that speed would most certainly have walked straight into that locked door, but nothing. It really freaked me out, and had me already dreading the next night. This became a common occurrence, every night for a few weeks, and one night I vividly remember leaving my bedroom door open. Around the same time I heard the creaking, I remember turning around and seeing a figure, blacker than black, moving backwards and forwards outside my bedroom door. It was just visible in the darkness of the hallway, and I couldn't take my eyes off it the entire time it was there. It's safe to say I never slept with my door open again after that night. But this is where things start to get really creepy. I'd been terrified of this shadow figure for weeks now. There was a really ominous feeling attached to it. It felt like it was after me. One evening, as I was headed towards the stairs for dinner, I froze in place as I got that really chilling feeling, and I heard the sound of the floorboard creaking behind me. I slowly turned around and looked towards the annex door, and there, as sure as anything, was that shadow figure, only now it was walking towards me at a high speed. I ran downstairs as quickly as I possibly could and explained everything to my parents. They mostly laughed it off and didn't believe me, trying to reassure me that ghosts aren't real. They said that I was just being paranoid because of what we'd been told about the old lady, but insisted that there was absolutely no chance that her spirit was still inside the house. Now, a bit of a backstory. Apparently, the old lady was absolutely terrified of the previous owner's dog. So much so that they'd installed a pulley system in the house. The old lady could pull a cord from her bedroom that would ring a bell in the kitchen whenever she needed anything. This whole system was still there when we moved into the house. The night after I told my parents about my experience in the upstairs hallway, I was awoken at around 2:30 a.m. by the sound of a bell ringing in the kitchen. It was loud, and it was constant, as if it was being pulled firmly with intent. I ran out into the corridor, and to my surprise, my parents were already there, equally as concerned and confused as I was. We all looked at each other, with an intense expression of fear on our faces. We all ran downstairs into the kitchen to see what was going on, but the second we entered the kitchen, the ringing stopped. We ventured up into the annex to see what could have been causing the bell to ring, but we found nothing. There was no sign of anyone or anything that could have been causing that bell to ring. But my God, I hated it in there. It was even colder and more lifeless than the rest of the house, and I felt like I had to get out of there as quickly as possible. At this point, My parents still didn't quite believe that there was a ghost in the house, but they were clearly less skeptical than before. From this point, the activity became more intense and obvious than before. All three of us started hearing knocking from the Annex door right next to my bedroom. There were noises coming from downstairs that sounded like somebody was moving things around. Sometimes, my fish tank light in my room would turn on and off, and there'd be an audible click. I'd also often be woken up in the middle of the night by the sound of my wardrobe doors opening and closing. One night, I was sat alone in my bedroom reading a book, when my wardrobe doors opened with relative force. Cautiously, I got up from my bed and closed the doors, then ran downstairs to tell my parents what had happened. When I came back upstairs about 15 minutes later, every single cupboard door, around a dozen of them, were open. Lots more went on too. Taps turning themselves on became a particularly regular occurrence. One night, I was awoken again by the sound of my cupboard door opening. I noticed a set of wet footprints going all the way from the bathroom right next to the annex, all the way to my bed. But there was no set of footprints going back out again. I was terrified. My grandma had begun to grow unwell, and she couldn't care for herself anymore, so she moved in with us. Much like me, she hated the house straight away. My grandma was so incredibly sweet and calm. I've never seen her so distressed as she was in that house. One night in particular, I was sat downstairs in the kitchen with her, when she took my hand and pointed towards the annex. She said, "Don't you go in there. I don't like it in there." Needless to say, this scared the crap out of me. On the last night we all spent together in that house, I was awoken in the middle of the night by the chilling sound of my mum screaming. She said, as clear as day, she felt two hands grab her by the ankles from underneath the bedsheets and yank her down the bed at least a few inches. Right there and then, she insisted that we leave that house. By the time we eventually moved out of the house, the activity had been going on for around 6 months. We went to stay back in our old house for a while, but it wasn't big enough for the four of us. So my stepdad, the biggest skeptic amongst us all, decided to stay in Lylet Cottage for a few more months. To this day, he's still reluctant to mention that house. He really hates talking about it. But even he admits that there was something incredibly wrong in Lylet Cottage. Without much warning, he put the cottage up for sale, so desperate to sell it that he got back even less than he'd paid for it. But he never told us why. I've promised myself that one day I'll reach out to the current owners of Lylet Cottage and ask them if they have experienced anything similar to what I did. Have you ever experienced anything like this before? That brings this video to an end. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope these stories give you nightmares. If you enjoy scary stories, then please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for a feast of grim and grisly content. Also, if you have any thoughts on today's stories, please leave them in the comments section down below. I'm your host, Severed Soul.